Good evening. My name is Carla Durand, and on behalf of the Collegeville Institute, I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's lecture, The Migrant's Double Vision, Understanding Pope Francis's Culture of Encounter. In his first Pentecost homily, Pope Francis challenged Christians to cultivate a culture of encounter by moving beyond comfort zones to engage difference in a mutually transformative manner. By taking the double vision of migrants seriously as a catalyst for theological reflection, this call acquires a distinct way of viewing reality that resists the temptations of the center in light of the Christ event. Tonight, our speaker, Jaisy Joseph, will explore this claim by examining how the interstitial insights of theologians from the Vietnamese American, Mexican American, and African American contexts contribute to an understanding of the transformative potential of encounter. A few words about Jaisy. Jaisy is a Ph.D. candidate in systematic theology at Boston College, where she is completing her dissertation on the Catholicity of the U.S. Church in light of migration and globalization. Her project is supported by a dissertation fellowship from the Louisville Institute and also by the Collegeville Institute, where she is a resident scholar and a Killian McDonald Fellowship in Faith and Culture. She is an active member of the Syro-Malabar Catholic Diocese of Chicago and the author of The Struggle for Identity Among Syro-Malabar Catholics. She will be teaching next year at Seattle University as an assistant professor of Christian ethics in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. So please join me in welcoming Jaisy Joseph.
So I just want to thank you all for coming out tonight, and I really look forward to our conversation after the presentation. So, The Migrant's Double Vision, Understanding Pope Francis's Culture of Encounter. So, from April 24th to 28th of last year, the media organization TED Talk held its annual conference in Vancouver with the theme, The Future You. On the second day, they had a surprise guest speaker. Let's listen to the first few minutes of his recorded address to this global audience.
Mi è piaciuto molto il titolo, The Future You, perché mentre guarda al domani, invita già da oggi al dialogo. Guardando al futuro, invita a rivolgersi a un tu. The future you. Il futuro è fatto di te, è fatto cioè di incontri, perché la vita scorre attraverso le relazioni. Parecchi anni di vita mi hanno fatto maturare sempre più la convinzione che l'esistenza di ciascuno di noi è legata a quella degli altri. La vita non è tempo che passa, ma tempo di incontro. Incontrando, ascoltando ammalati che soffrono, migranti che affrontano tremende difficoltà in cerca di un futuro migliore, carcerati che portano l'inferno nel proprio cuore, persone specialmente giovani che non hanno lavoro, mi accompagna spesso una domanda: perché loro e non io? Anch'io sono nato in una famiglia di migranti. Mio papà, i miei nonni, come tanti altri italiani, sono partiti per l'Argentina e hanno conosciuto la sorte di chi resta senza nulla. Anch'io avrei potuto essere tra gli scartati di oggi. Perciò nel mio cuore rimane sempre quella domanda: perché loro e non io?
So just in the first 2 minutes of his talk, Pope Francis expresses a number of key insights that set us up for our conversation today. And I just want to point out 3. So first, he said, the future is made of yous. It is made of encounters, because life flows through our relations with others. Second, each and everyone's existence is deeply tied to that of others. Life is not time merely passing by. Life is about interactions or encounters. And third, I always ask myself deep in my heart, why them and not me? These quotations all reflect a deeply relational worldview that emphasizes the interconnectedness of reality, within persons, between persons, with the cosmos, and with God. Guided by this relational worldview, my talk today will be divided into 3 parts. 1, what exactly is encounter? What is Pope Francis drawing on when he uses that word? 2, what is this diasporic consciousness that I have in my title? What is the migrant's double vision? And finally, how do those 2 relate in cultivating a culture of encounter moving forward? So first, what is encounter? The answer to this is actually twofold. First, in the lines of his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis claims that, quote, he never tires of repeating those words of Benedict XVI, which take us to the very heart of the gospel. Being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. From this claim, we understand that the experience of encounter is at the root of what it means to be Christian. Christianity is not a philosophy or ideology. It is not a set of ideas or propositions of what is right and wrong. Christianity is a personal, transformative experience with the living God in Jesus Christ. This experience leads to conversion and changes the orientation of one's life. Think of St. Thomas the Apostle, who could only cry out, "My Lord and my God," after encountering the wounds in the risen Christ's hands and side. Or St. Augustine, who was transformed by the scripture verses in the garden. These are not experiences frozen in the past, but an invitation to each Christian to discover within the heart of the church. This brings us to our second half of the response to the question, what is encounter? As Carla had mentioned, in his Pentecost homily in 2013, Pope Francis claimed that by stepping out, by going out to the peripheries, the church becomes, quote, ready for encounter. For me, this word is very important, encounter with others. Why? Because faith is an encounter with Jesus, and we must do what Jesus does, encounter others. With our faith, we must create a culture of encounter, a culture of friendship, a culture in which we find brothers and sisters, in which we can also speak with those who think differently. So from this answer, we see that Christianity is not about individualistic piety or salvation. It is intrinsically social and communal. Both popes, Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, draw their twofold understanding of encounter from Romano Guardini. And he was a theologian and a precursor of the Second Vatican Council who really wrestled with this question, what does it mean to be a human person? He believed that to be a human person is to simultaneously possess personal freedom and to maintain social being. So personal freedom for him was to be aware of oneself as a knowing subject, as an I. And for that I, and this is related to being a social being, for that I to enter into an I-you relationship with other persons, human and divine. He draws a lot of his inspiration from Martin Buber, who was a Jewish scholar. And 2 points that Buber brings out is the I-you is in contrast, of course, to the I-it. The I-you enables mutual disclosure. It is only through recognizing the other as a you that mutual disclosure is even possible. Buber says, I require a you to become. Becoming I say you. All life is encounter. I begin to open myself up to the other. And the relation, however, is incomplete if the other does not open up him or herself to me. So I become another you to your I. Furthermore, God is the eternal you, which all other yous point towards. Guardini expands on this by emphasizing that God is the existential source and goal of human life. Otherwise, we will fall victim to heteronomy and autonomy. And those are his words. So heteronomy, he says, places authority for one's life outside of oneself. And so this is where we fall into the danger, for example, of finding our authority in another human being, an ideology, an institution, or a government. And this is the context, of course, he's writing within the totalitarian regimes of Hitler and later communism. Autonomy locates authority for one's life in oneself. For example, an excessive reliance on reason or the will to power. Theonomy, he says, God is where God is the only absolute authority for human life. And this living God sets each human person free to become a whole person, an I through the divine recognition of a you, because the eternal you can never be reduced to an it. And so the human response then is to enter into an I-you relationship with the divine through Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. So this is sort of the background. This is the setting that is informing what Pope Francis is saying when he says, the future use, the future is use, and the future is encounter. And this is what is informing Pope Benedict as well. And so both of them are coming out of this understanding of encounter. So in light of this I-you relationship, what does it mean to go to the peripheries, to create a culture of encounter? The first part is, of course, an instruction to those who reside in the centers of power and of comfort. The second one, however, is the responsibility of everyone. It is for those who reside both at the center and peripheries of power to cultivate this culture of encounter. Both teachings encourage an encounter with different yous. And this is sort of what Pope Francis is adding to Guardini's understanding of this encounter. With globalization and migration, the centrifugal and centripetal forces are now coming and encountering each other, right? There's no longer just one stagnant periphery, one stagnant center. And in the US context in particular, the peripheries are entering into traditional metropolitan centers. So what would it mean then to go from understanding these others as, and also the boundaries are no longer, Schreider says the boundaries are no longer just territorial or geographic. The boundaries are of difference. So what would it mean then to not consider the other as an object of charity or pity, and that would be a reduction into an I-it relationship, but as fellow agents of evangelization? What would it mean to consider them and to engage them in an I-you rather than I-it relationship? What I argue is that it would foster an engagement with the diasporic consciousness. In an age of globalization and migration, post-colonial theorists have said that possibly the truest I may now belong to the migrant's double vision. Migrants, whether contemporary or historically conquered and enslaved, develop a consciousness as to navigate between centers and peripheries to survive. And I think that's interesting. It's not an intellectual exercise, it's not a whim. It was a consciousness that was meant to survive within a space where they were denied power. So then, my dissertation, my research, really looks at what this diasporic consciousness means and how people have fostered a decentered and multiple-centered consciousness that can help the U.S. Church to recenter itself on Christ. And what would that mean? So the second part of my presentation, it really looks more at 3 case studies that are trying to get at what this diasporic consciousness is. And it looks at first the betwixt and between consciousness, and how that informs divine marginalization from a Vietnamese American perspective. The second case study is the mestizaje consciousness, and how that informs an understanding of Jesus as the Galilean Jew from a Mexican American perspective. And third, double consciousness, and how that informs an understanding of Christ crucified from an African American perspective. And then we will get into what all of this means as not just being parallel realities, but informing a unified church, a unified understanding of what it means to be a church. So first, betwixt and between consciousness and divine marginalization, a Vietnamese American perspective. For Vietnamese Catholic theologian Peter C. Phan, his entire life was shattered in April 1975. In the weeks prior to the communist invasion of Saigon, people fled for their lives. Pictures of boats carrying anxious families filled the media in the waning days of the Vietnam War. Unable to afford seats on the planes or boats, Phan and his family had no way of leaving the country. through these are his words, serendipitous combination of chance occurrences, a shortage of planes, a late breakfast, an auntie who accidentally broke her leg, a shrewd substitution of names, and a last-minute flight, Fawn and his family's lives were spared as they made it to the United States as refugees. Only after being transferred from Guam to California could Fawn and his family reflect on the enormity of their situation. Asked to respond to the spiritual needs of refugees, Fan witnessed immense agony as individuals threatened suicide and suffered mental breakdowns in the US. Eventually, Fawn and his family were relocated to Texas, where they were given temporary employment. Working briefly as a garbage collector, Fan eventually found work as an adjunct professor of theology at the University of Dallas. These experiences deeply influenced his theological imagination. For him, exile and the resultant state of being betwixt and between have permanently impressed upon him the fragility of things and the ephemeral character of time. Fan further defines how living betwixt and between is neither here nor there, to be neither this thing nor that. Spatially, it is to dwell at the periphery or at the boundaries. Politically, it means not residing at the centers of power of the two intersecting worlds, but occupying the precarious and narrow margins where the two dominant groups meet and clash, and denied opportunity to wield power in matters of public interest. Socially, to be betwixt and between is to be part of a minority, a member of a marginalized group. Culturally, it means not being fully integrated into and accepted by either cultural system. Linguistically, the betwixt and between person is bilingual, but may not achieve a mastery of both languages, and often speaks them with a distinct accent. Psychologically and spiritually, the person does not possess a well-defined and secure self-identity, and is often marked with excessive impressionableness, rootlessness, and an inordinate desire to belong. Each of these dimensions captures the existential pain of living in between two worlds. He further draws on Korean theologian Jung Jung Lee, who argues that this experience of fitting in neither world is a taste of the existential nothingness at the heart of dehumanization. Many who exist between cultures experience a divided self, a split consciousness of self-alienation. This self-negating vision of marginality, however, before I get to that, he has this diagram in his text where he's saying that the Asian American is placed right in between the centers, and that's where he exists. That's a way of graphically expressing what the periphery looks like. And it's not just a periphery of one center, but the periphery of multiple centers, and being caught between those, and being pushed into that space, and experiencing the divided self. But the self-negating vision of marginality is not the whole story. Lee also foregrounds a self-affirming vision that has become increasingly visible in a globalized context. To stress in-bothness is to affirm full participation in both the country of origin and the country of nationality. It is to assert the agency and rights of Asian Americans to be fully Asian and fully American, co-equal with all other ethnicities in the country. So in this sense, the person is able to push back with a growing sense of their own dignity. But of course, that's not, that often is not the initial stance that a person feels. So in this, both positive and negative, what Lee wants to argue is that the positive conception of in-bothness doesn't replace, eliminate, or assimilate the negative experiences of in-betweenness. He's not arguing for a dialectical progression, but rather naming two sides of the same consciousness for those who live in between multiple worldviews and multiple centers. Marginal people simultaneously experience the pain of despair and the hope for transformation. Between two centers, the in-between and the in-both, are located at the same margin, which does not exist independently of other centers, but rather in this third space. Lee, however, pushes the imagination further than existing simultaneously in between and in both. He argues for a more radically open third consciousness of in beyond. This consciousness recognizes that the point where the two margins of distinct centers touch is a new creative core. The creative core does not replace the old centers of power, the centers of centrality, but becomes the margin of marginality, a self-consciously chosen marginality. In this sense, the marginal person transcends not apart from the exigencies of time and space, but rather she is not bound by them. She becomes a wounded healer, a peacemaker between conflicting worlds. And this is again, not a calling for everyone. It shouldn't be imposed on everyone that experiences the despair and hope that are placed at the center. But for some, it becomes a space where they learn to translate and negotiate and give language, and with the hope of helping others who are facing that sense of the existential dehumanization. So this is sort of a reflection on what it means to be human from this stance, from this standpoint, what it means to be human and theologically. But then Lee goes further and tries to give a Christological dimension to this. And ultimately for him, he argues that such a consciousness, purified of temptations towards the center, is a share in the consciousness of Christ. It is to possess, ultimately, the mind of Christ, found in 1 Corinthians 2:16. From this perspective, both Lee and Fawn argue that Jesus was the new marginal person par excellence. Lee states that the incarnation exemplifies divine marginalization. From the human perspective, the Synoptic Gospels reveal how Jesus was born into marginality, conceived by an unwed mother, born far from his hometown, and sheltered in a manger and in flight to Egypt. From the divine perspective, the Philippian hymn claims that God became empty and took on the form of a servant. This kenotic act of love is described as emptiness, not just by becoming any human being, but by becoming the lowest human being in terms of social status. Servants, according to Lee, do not belong to the dominant group. They are outsiders, alienated from the world in which they live. For God to empty God's self and take on the nature of a servant is to exist at the margin of marginality. At this point, he fully belongs to neither world, divine or human. But it is through this total negation, to the point of death, even death on a cross, that Jesus also affirms both worlds in himself. As the hymn affirms, or says, God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So at that margin of marginality, Jesus exists simultaneously as the servant of all servants and the Lord of all lords. Thus, Jesus is the new marginal person who exists in beyond. Located at the margin of marginality, Christ becomes the new center through which all differences find reconciliation without assimilation. So that's the first case study of how a diasporic consciousness makes sense of this experience of living in between as a refugee and as a recent migrant, and gives insight into the Christ event in terms of the incarnation. The second one that I want to present to you guys for discussion is the Mestizaje consciousness and the Galilean Jew, a Mexican-American perspective. So born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, Virgilio Elizondo viewed his whole life as one of crossing borders. The question, who am I, haunted him as he entered college and seminary. In the US, he was considered Mexican, which was often a derogatory term within a highly segregated society in the 1940s of Texas. And in Mexico, he attracted attention as a pocho, a Mexican who was too Americanized to belong. For the Mexican-American people, he says, the separation between the United States and Mexico reached the very depths of our individual and collective souls. The separation seemed irreparable. It seemed that no matter where we were, Mexico or the United States, we had to be constantly apologizing for who we were. Too gringo for the Mexicans and too Mexican for the Americans. All of this produced a certain type of shame in being who we were, for we had no place we could really call home, where we could really be ourselves. The only being we knew was in our non-being, and the only place we had was in between Mexico and the United States. In 1967, Elizondo visited Father Francisco Aguilera in Mexico City and was struck by how comfortable the latter was with his mestizo identity as both Spanish and American Indian. Their first stop was Plaza de las Tres Culturas, where the final battle between the Spanish and the Aztecs took place. Located within the colonial church that rested on the ruins of pyramid temples was an inscription. On this site, on the sad night of August 13, 1521, heroically taken by Cortez, valiantly defended by the Aztecs, it was neither a defeat nor a victory, but the painful birth of the mestizo people, which is Mexico today. Pondering this socio-historical reality of conquest and bloodshed, Elizondo accompanied Father Aguilera to their second destination, the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe. There, the priest explained that in and through Mary, the Iberian soul united with the ancient Mexican soul to give birth to the mestizo soul of Mexico. This was the ongoing miracle of Guadalupe, and what truly made her the mother of the Americas. In that moment, Elizondo experienced an epiphany that allowed him to come to grips with the innermost reality of his being and that of his people. What appeared to me to be an experience of non-being was simply the beginning of a new being. In 1531, the apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe to the poor indigenous Christian, Juan Diego, left an indelible mark on the mestizaje consciousness of the Mexican people. Through the indigenous symbols associated with this apparition, Guadalupe provided a third space for the indigenous people in a world that had rejected them. Likewise, the Battle of Alamo in San Antonio was not one of defeat, but the birth of a people, for him, the birth of a soul, the birth of a spirituality, the birth of a church, and the birth of a religion. In that moment of epiphany, Elizondo realized that he could be proud of his collective grandparent cultures, the Iberian and pre-Columbian Mexico, and of his immediate parents, the, quote, waspish United States and the mestizo Catholic Mexico. Through this epiphany, Elizondo understood that the struggle for identity and belonging was not particular to his people, but reflected the human quest of people throughout the world. And the particular story of the individual is the universal story of humanity. Elizondo developed these insights in his seminal work, The Galilean Journey, The Mexican-American Promise, through an investigation of Jesus' historical cultural identity as a Galilean Jew. Galilee was not a religious, intellectual, or political center, but a major intersection of numerous trade routes. Located on the peripheries of Jerusalem, Galilee had been invaded by several empires, allowing Jesus to enter the world surrounded by Phoenicians, Syrians, Arabs, Greeks, Orientals, and Jews. The Jews of Jerusalem treated their Galilean counterparts with contempt for mixing with others. Their, quote, mestizaje condition, occasioned by their contact with foreigners and distance from Jerusalem, was a sign of impurity and a cause for rejection. Their mestizaje conditioned, Despite these differences, Jews of both the center and the periphery were united by their common faith in the God of Moses and the prophets. In this sense, Elizondo argues, the image of the Galileans to the Jerusalem Jews is comparable to the image of Mexican Americans to the Mexicans of Mexico. On the other hand, the image of the Galileans to the Greco-Romans is comparable to the image of the Mexican American to the Anglo population of the United States. They are part of and despised by both. It is this very insignificance of Galilee in comparison to Jerusalem that reveals how God works. From the perspective of the peripheries, Jerusalem was at the center of the powers that excluded and oppressed the masses through purity laws of inclusion and exclusion. It housed the roots of power structures that hid violence against many in the name of God. To question the practices associated with the temple was to challenge the roots of Judaism and as it had developed at the time of Jesus. In the sight of numerous pilgrims, Jesus attacked the commercialization of worship by quoting scripture. Quote, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all the peoples, but you have made it a robber's den," from Mark 11:17. His expulsion of the merchants from the temple brought him into direct conflict with the Jewish authorities. Exposed as exploiters rather than protectors of the most vulnerable in society, the chief priests and the elders decided to eliminate this threat to their established system. The necessity of scapegoating Jesus to preserve a way of life revealed how the established way had become a new idol, a new golden calf. This idol was not adored in words, but in the daily deeds of life that absolutized norms, values, and ideas that functioned as God and hid the real face of the living God. The voice of the prophet was silenced for daring to unmask the perversions of power. Instead, Jesus revealed a way through which all who followed him learned to deny themselves of the temptation towards the center, pick up their cross, and serve the poor and the marginalized. And finally, the double consciousness and Christ crucified, an African American perspective. In 1903, E.B. Du Bois wrote about how the sudden revelation first burst upon him that he was different from others. As a young boy in New England, the students in his schoolhouse decided to buy 10-cent visiting cards from the others and exchange them. For Du Bois, the exchange was merry, until one girl, quote, a tall newcomer, refused my card, refused it preemptively with a glance. In the instance of a derogatory glance, he realized that a vast veil separated his world from theirs. Born into a world divided by this color line, the African American, he says, is gifted with a second sight that yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the African American person in the U.S. is the desire to attain a self-consciousness capable of merging this double self into one. Du Bois goes on to say further, wishing neither to Africanize America or to bleach his Negro soul, he knows that both worlds have something to teach the other. He, the African American, simply desires to exist in the interstitial space between both worlds without facing dehumanizing terror. Sociologist Paul Gilroy argues that a consistent theme throughout Du Bois's writing is the emphasis on terror as a defining feature of slave regimes. While the slave ship inaugurated this terror, the public spectacle of lynching retained its hateful residues. So between the end of the Civil War and 1968, nearly 5,000 black women and men were lynched as a means of maintaining white dominance and control of racial caste. In Dusk of Dawn, Du Bois writes about the powerful effect of Sam Hose's lynching upon him. Hose was a poor laborer in Georgia who was lynched and mutilated after a dispute over wages with his white boss. The Springfield, Massachusetts Weekly Republican described the lynch. Just as a side note, I was debating if I wanted to keep this in or not, and then I reread Sean Copeland's introduction to her book about it's not, making a spectacle of this, but by discussing what actually happened, we know the reality. So, yeah, so I can write this, but even when I was practicing, I felt uncomfortable reading it, but I'm going to read it, and we'll talk about it. So, before the torch was applied to the pyre, the Negro was deprived of his ears, fingers, and genital parts of his body. He pleaded pitifully for his life while the mutilation was going on, but stood the ordeal of fire with surprising fortitude. Before the body was cool, it was cut to pieces, the bones crushed into small bits, and even the tree upon which the wretch met his fate was torn up and disposed as souvenirs. The Negro's heart was cut into several pieces, as was also his liver. Those unable to obtain the ghastly relics paid their more fortunate possessors extravagant sums for them. Small pieces of bones went for 25 cents, and a bit of liver, crisply cooked, sold for 10 cents. One street from where Du Bois taught as a sociology professor, Sam Hose's severed knuckles were put on display in the storefront of a grocery store. The 1899 incident transformed Du Bois. He stated, quote, "One could not be calm and cool and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. Lynching was a powerful weapon of social control that reasserted white dominance and privilege, especially as a means of easing Southern defeat after the Civil War. So the parallels between these tortured bodies and the one who, quote, redeemed us by becoming a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, Galatians 3:13, did not escape the religious imagination of African American Christians. According to James Cone, until we can see the cross and the lynching tree together, until we can identify Christ with a re-crucified black body hanging from a lynching tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America, and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. From a theological perspective, Jesus' lynching foreshadowed the lynched bodies of those on American soil. Both were crucified by the same principalities and powers. Cone argues, every time a white mob lynched a black person, they lynched Jesus. The lynching tree is the cross in America. Both the Romans and white lynchers claimed that they were the, quote, good citizens, while those they crucified were the real criminals. God, however, was fully present with Jesus on the cross and did not let Satan and death have the last word. In the same manner, God was present with every innocent black body that hung from a tree. This reversal is the meaning of the paradox of the cross. What is a cursed symbol of death and defeat, God transforms into a sign of life and liberation. The significance of the cross cannot be spiritualized away from its message of justice for the poor and the marginalized. As a, quote, locus of divine revelation, the cross is not good news for the powerful, for those who are comfortable with the way things are, or for anyone whose understanding of religion is aligned with power. And that was James Cone. God rejects what is valued by humans, Luke 16:15, but loves what the world rejects. So here are 3 case studies, the double consciousness, the betwixt and between consciousness, and the mestizaje consciousness, that are all reflecting on A, what it means to be human, and B, how that understanding of humanity reflects in an understanding of Christ. So that brings me to a 3rd section. What does this all mean for cultivating a culture of encounter? Let's go back to what Pope Francis said. The future is made of yous. It is made of encounters, because life flows through our relations with others. And that's not just today, that's all of the past, all the different histories. So from these 3 examples, we understand that the future is also made of vastly different yous that have very different histories and that are encountering reality in different ways. And they have much to say about what it means to be human and who Jesus Christ is. So these 3 different yous answer Christ's question, but who do you say that I am, in different ways. Peter C. Fan talked about the divine marginalization, and he came to understand Christ as not just the servant of servants, but the Lord of lords, simultaneously, not one before the other. Elizondo discussed the Galilean Jew, and it challenges our idea of the center that displaces God, the central ideas, central ways of looking at things. And DeBois and James Cone discussed the lynched Christ and really brought out the paradox of the cross. So each of these responses nourishes the responses of others for a fuller manifestation of the body of Christ. In this sense, I argue that a culture of encounter does not speak about others or for others. A culture of encounter allows people to talk from their decentered perspectives. And it gives testimony of their encounter with God for the building up of the church. This posture of listening and dialogue changes the nature of encounter. Often the center patronizes the periphery in a manner that reinforces the binary. To consistently regard the other as peripheral or marginal encourages the attitude that they are objects of pity, never to be fully included as equals. Unilateral assistance or a missionary impulse towards the periphery prevents true encounter by maintaining this perpetual gap between giver and receiver. In fact, it even becomes neo-colonial. Rather, all are called to resist the temptations of the center and to view reality through a decentered, diasporic epistemology or consciousness. To resist this temptation is to work towards cultivating this culture of encounter, where we discover the other as brothers and sisters. The church is itself an institutional migrant that exists in the already but not yet. Caught between this world and the next, it too must navigate and negotiate how best to dwell within a diaspora space with fellow pilgrims, and as fellow pilgrims. The church must be formed by the decentered consciousness of immigration and diaspora. These realities spiritually form Christians by giving them a glimpse into their own existential orientation towards God. According to Orlando Espín, journeying towards the reign of God is an indispensable, non-negotiable, and foundational reality of what it means to be Christian. The church must be formed by the realities of immigration and diaspora, and not because of political correctness or momentary inconvenience, but because this is the very essence of Christianity. Through loving encounter with one's neighbor, the faithful develop a double vision that encourages them to live fully in the world, but not be tempted by the centers to become of the world. Thank you. It looks like we have about 15 minutes, so if you have any questions or thoughts. Yeah, Topo.
Thank you very much, Jaisy. It's very interesting and stimulating. Two things that I guess one is like more like comment, and the other one is a question, like I guess potentially a challenge. But first, I appreciate reference to Martin Luther and the lion relationship, which is so central to I think Christian theology today. When you talked about like two individuals with their disclosure or disclosing themselves to each other, I guess I find it more helpful to think in terms of vulnerability for change. Mm-hmm. For me, I and our relationship is more like taking a risk of being changed by other person, and also changing other person, which is also very risky. So this is just my thoughts. The other one is about, I think, issue of innocence. When you're talking about James Cone and African American experience, you talked about what Mike Cone talked about seeing Christ in an innocent person lynched. Mm-hmm. But you know, as a Christian, I wonder if it's necessary to say that that person being lynched has to be innocent.
Sure.
For me, God's revelation takes place under what is contrary. So I'm Lutheran. And that means that God reveals God's self to us precisely in the place where we cannot accept, which is maybe the person whom we hate, and that's precisely where we are being called. But I think our reference to person being innocent gives or creates like an excuse, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on this.
Yeah. So first, just in response to your comment, I actually really like that, and I think that that's why I think encounter is such a powerful term, because it's intended for it rather than meeting or some other word, like it's meant to have a connotation of change. That's what happens after this interaction, right? So I agree, and I think that having that vulnerability is key, because if that vulnerability isn't there, then the fullness of an IU relationship isn't possible. So thank you for that. And then it's really interesting that you picked up on that, because even when I was writing it, I had that thought, like innocence. I didn't want that to stand out as the defining criteria for what is the common ground for seeing Christ crucified in the lynched black bodies. Rather, I think so it doesn't actually matter, like you were saying, it doesn't matter if the person was innocent or not, but rather seeing that it's the same principalities and powers that are at work in both situations, and how God is on the side of the one that is being so brutally crucified in the end, right? So thank you for bringing that up, and it's just an adjective in one sentence, so I can just strike that out so it doesn't cause confusion. So thank you. Yeah, Ernie. And then,
The gentleman.
why don't we say Ernie and then Jim?
yeah. Sure.
Just a couple of comments. You're not looking for more to read, I'm sure.
Don't mind.
But, you know, Cornell West is really powerful about lynching and cross. And in a sense, as updated was and James Cone and Black liberation theology, African American liberation theology, the Lord Black Christ, and that was with Cone. And he does a little deeper contemporary sociological analysis of the presence of African Americans in American society in the late 20th century, early 21st century. So if you wanted to update some of that.
Sure.
The other person which struck me, and again, I'm sitting, a duck out of water here, but Carl Rahner is sensibly on encounter, and the theology of encounter, and someone here could probably cite the sources. So, given your background with Francis, there would be some other material perhaps to draw on there that we may be drawing. I don't know if on that this is urgent. Because often when I'm talking about encounter in coming out of 60s and 70s theology, I use Rahner's reflections. Where do we go with this? I mean, I think you've laid out in beautiful and sometimes horrific character, at least the reality of the other. And the danger we have in American society is co-optation. One of them. That whenever you try to get a movement of resistance or a counterculture movement, the next thing you know, it's being marketed as Macy's. And I guess I would wonder, to say this the so what question would be too simplistic here, but where do we go, where would you want to see us go with this theologically or even personally?
So a couple thoughts on that. One is, so I feel like, it's just really interesting. I grew up Syro-Malabar Catholic, and so we had our own church, kind of a parallel reality for the most part in the U.S. And I always remember that on Pentecost Sunday, the Roman Catholic Church would want my dad to read the petition in Malayalam, in our language. And that's the only time that we were asked to bring ourselves there. And so I would go, and my dad would force me to dress up in an Indian outfit because he would wear just pants and shirt. And I would just always, and I would see everybody else in their outfits, and then we'd have food, and that's it. And then you go back the next Sunday, and you're just whatever, right? If we went to Roman Catholic Church the next Sunday. So to me, it seems so superficial. It really is just looking at all of our sense of identity as a costume for the most part, and everyone is just sort of at a cafeteria and engaging each other in that way. So what I think theologically what this does, and maybe a second example is when I read Elizondo's work as a sophomore in college, I was I'm not Mexican American, but I was in Texas, but the way that he was describing his understanding, it really empowered me to start thinking, well then what does it mean for me as an Indian American, Syro-Malabar Catholic, what does that mean for me to talk about Christ? And so I think that by maybe reorienting Sunday school lessons or something, you're inspiring people to start thinking about their own understanding of what it means to be human and what that means to understand Christ. And so in a sense, I don't want it to become co-opted. I don't want it to become marketed in that sense. But I think if it goes back to the heart of what an encounter is, it's supposed to awaken that consciousness in people. If it's done, I think maybe in that missionary disciple sense, right? Not just sort of here is a platter of everything and pick and choose, but what does this all mean for our encounter with Christ and our encounter with each other as equal pilgrims in this journey towards the same destination. So I think reorienting the imagination, maybe, and yeah, that's something I'm playing with. So.
It's true encounter, your examples here, of course, at least as I recall, with Ronner, it's a change in self-understanding.
Right.
You don't emerge from a depth encounter, which is the word the other day. Depth encounter, the same person you went in.
Right.
You learn some things, sometimes painful things about yourself, and your whole self-understanding gets transformed.
Right.
Hopefully for the better.
Right.
And that's why we avoid it as much as we do, because it takes too much emotional and intellectual energy.
Right.
Jim?
I think Jim, and then
Oh, I just had a quick question about the image you showed of the lynching tree.
sure.
Is that a well-known image? I mean, are paintings or posters like that very widely distributed? Or not necessarily the one that you showed, but that one included?
So I found this online, but I've kind of kept it for whenever I lecture on this. I've kept it, but I do remember maybe I don't know if it's widespread. It was the first time I'd seen that, last year, 2 years ago. But I do remember that there were similar images that were shocking to me as an undergrad student when people were saying God is black, and I had and it's meant to do that for someone who's not raised in that context. But I think that is a prevalent sort of way of talking in a certain certain expression of Christianity. But was there more, or was it?
No, I was just curious about that image. It is very colorful.
Right. Kathleen, and then.
Well, no.
Well, thank you very much for this really intriguing presentation, and I just feel like you mastered these three great theologians of our time. So they've done their theological, both their anthropology and Christology, in this context in which their communities are really marginalized in relationship to a dominant white agriculture, as you said. But that's passing. That's to me, that's yesterday in many ways. What is it going to look like when minority is majority and these three communities constitute the majority of, let's just say, the Catholic community in the United States or the population of the United States? What's the nature of encounter in that different demographic and social and cultural and political space? What's going to happen?
So two separate thoughts. One is that I actually don't think numbers make a difference. So, because I think it really is at the end of the day it's a history that's been internalized, and it's also the power dynamics, right? So in that sense, even if, say, Latin American Catholics become the majority in the U.S. Catholic Church, there's still a history that's there that is informing their understanding. So it's not simply in that sense, I think it's, if we go to Pope Francis' understanding of going to even the existential peripheries, what that means for the person. And so I think that this way of theologizing is the foundation for which future theologians from these communities will build on. But I don't think that it will become, because I do know that I'm resistant too, because it could be a fad, right? But it's not, because I think that if it really is calling people to an encounter, then and helping them to grow and develop in their understanding of themselves in Christ, fad or not, it's doing some work, right? So I think that. And then the other thing is, it's even if a lot of the double consciousness is between a minority population in the dominant culture, it's still equally an encounter for me when I engage Mexican American theologians or African American or Vietnamese. It's so even these encounters that have nothing to do with the dominant culture. And so I think in that sense, there needs to be, I feel that there was a lot of, maybe in the 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of digging into everyone's own traditions, but now there has to be a communication across, or a deeper communication across, or encounter across these traditions. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Don?
Trying to get at what something that's a little bit slippery
Sure.
in the presentation. And maybe the easiest way to get at it would be, so the first and the third of your case studies, the language was very much about self-identity, achieving self-identity in these circumstances, whereas the middle one was about the identity of the people. So I'm kind of, who is the encounter between? Is it between an individual and culture? Is it an individual and a people, or is it the encounter of peoples? Because your language slid around
Sure.
In terms of we will discover that we are in this encounter, or I will discover that I am in this encounter. And the language of Guardini and Buber tends to be
Right.
of an individual encountering another, and not as a social group encountering another social group. But
Yeah.
in fact, especially in the case of Mexican Americans, it is the encounter of a group with another group. Or now, we tend to think of an encounter between Muslims and non-Muslim Americans or Christians or something like that. So large groups. Who do you have in mind in terms of what is an encounter?
So, so a couple of things. One is that I think you're right in naming, and maybe I will be more careful, but it is a distinction that I think Buber and Guardini were talking about the individual more or less, because and they were in a context, maybe, I mean, it's still Nazi Germany, it's still, so there's a lot going on, but maybe it was in the way of theologizing or philosophizing to think of the individual and to make sure. But I think because Francis is talking about a culture encounter, there's multiple levels to it. And I actually think that maybe I'm drawing this from, I don't think that he would be opposed to Paul VI Ecclesiam Suum, right? Where there's all those different layers. But I think the consciousness, even with the Asian American and the African American, the consciousness of who one is related to the history of your people and a group, right? And what all you've brought, what are all the encounters that have brought you to where you are and that are a part of who you are. So I think the individual consciousness is awakened within the whole. And so then that shapes the encounter with others too. So I don't think it's necessarily like two separate things. But I will be careful with the language, but I do think that they're interconnected.
Yeah, I think they are too. I think that would be a helpful point of clarification.
Sure.
For us, if you were to say, who are you talking about, and what is the relationship? Just to press it further, I don't expect necessarily an answer to this, but it seems that the presentation assumes a stable I.
That's true.
And in postmodernity, we have an unstable I that is an I only in relationship to all kinds of different circumstances, which you just implied in your response to me. So there's another level of kind of complexity. It's very interesting, and I agree with Kathleen completely. This is fascinating, but these are just some questions that kind of occurred to me as you're making the presentation.
I think it is highlighting the desire for a stable I, within the recognition that there are multiple worldviews competing for a certain person. So the desire for some kind of integrity is there, but I think that in each of the cases, and even with the post-colonial lens, it's more the constant negotiations in that interstitial space that is recognizing all the other centers that are vying for the self. I think that might, but I can make that much more clear too, because I don't think it would be an illusion to say that there is a stable I, especially in these three scenarios or cases.
Take one last comment, Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to encourage you to use the lynching
Okay.
concrete example. And for me, that was by far the most important and gripping part of your talk because it was concrete. To talk about the marginality of the margins or the periphery of the peripheries means absolutely nothing to me.
Sure. Yeah.
So when you begin with a concrete experience and work out to what it means, I found that very compelling. And I also, in terms of James Cone and who's the
Cornel West.
help me, Cornel West. I mean, that's why West made Cone so well known, because he relies on primary experience and then takes the theory out. And I think that's what Black theology has done for us. I think Euro-American theology is oftentimes in this realm of theory, because we don't have to talk about our experience. And so, anyway, I don't know if you've seen the New Yorker issues they did called Souvenirs, and it was a whole black and white photo series in the early 20th century of all these kids with the souvenirs standing outside the lynching.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very good.
And there's one line where it's like, only if we anamnestically interrupt our amnesia can we move forward in a real culture of encounter. And that means reviving all of the really messy stuff. So yeah, it's just, yeah.
But
Thank
I mean,
you.
like Ralph Ellison took DeBois into The Invisible Man, and he wrote about the same thing. He hated being invisible, but he knew he kind of needed to be if he didn't want to be lynched. And so it's in that same tension. A lot of people just see, well, he wanted to be visible. Well, he didn't only want to be visible. He was like torn.
Right.
And Du Bois gets that in the code line. He's the first person who does it theoretically.
Thank you.